Most fire extinguishers have gauges on them. And if you look at that gauge, you'll notice that there's a red large indication on the left and another large red indication on the right. And then there's a narrow band of green that sits in the middle. With this gauge, there's a needle. And when it sits in either one of those red areas, it tells us that the fire extinguisher needs to be serviced. I was looking at one of these fire extinguishers the other day in my plant and was sitting there thinking about it and a couple things that I heard over the week. And really, I see leadership in the same way. There's behaviors in leadership that either put us on the left in the red, put us in the right on the red, or if we choose the right behaviors, it sets us in the green, where it positions us to really serve our people the best way possible.
Leaders are not born in a womb. They are forged through heat, pressure, and a whole lot of sweat. The Fire Forged Leader podcast serves the audience through exploring leadership at work, in the community, and with the family, using a practical perspective and real-life experiences from the host, Steve Baumgartner, and his guests in the Forge. Now, it's time to enter the Forge with the Fire Forged Leader.
What is up, leaders? Welcome once again to the Fire Forged Leader podcast. I'm Steve Baumgartner, your host and founder. And I would really just like to take you on a journey today of the Forge, where we're going to explore some lessons together learned on the front lines of leadership. Now, I started this whole thing out talking about fire extinguishers, right? Fire extinguishers, they're a great invention. They hold a ton of value when people need them the most. However, they only hold this value as long as we keep them maintained in their optimal state. When we do this, when we don't maintain them in their optimum state, they don't just fail themselves. They also fail the person using that fire extinguisher in their most dire moments. Properly charged, however, the person who's using that fire extinguisher is always thankful that the extinguisher was there. I've known a lot of people have used fire extinguishers in their kitchens or at work and saved thousands and thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of real estate or the company because they stop that small fire. So they have a lot of value. So with all this being said, we know in the industry, we know in manufacturing that it is highly important to make sure that these fire extinguishers are ready to go at 100% tip-top shape so that when it's go time, they are ready to go. So we invest into these fire extinguishers. So at a minimum, NFPA 10 requires that these extinguishers are inspected once per month. And in more hazardous conditions, they should be checked more frequently. So one of the major things that you check when you inspect a fire extinguisher, you inspect that pressure gauge. And that's why I'm talking about this pressure gauge, right? It's so vitally important to make sure that you have the right charge in a fire extinguisher so that it is ready for when you need to use it. So let me explain these gauges in a little bit more detail. They're pretty simple, they're easy to read. Usually on the left-hand side, you got um, a portion of a circle that's coded red, and it usually says something like undercharged on it. If you look at the right-hand side, there's that same amount of area that's red, and it says overcharged. And then, of course, you got that small stripe of green in the middle that represents that the fire extinguisher is good. So let's talk about the left for a second, the undercharged area. And there's really 2 points if you read about it, why you don't want an undercharged fire extinguisher. The first one is that you're probably not going to be able to extinguish the fire because there's not enough pressure in the thing. But the other thing is that it gives false hope, right? When people have a fire and they want to put it out, their home might be in jeopardy, their family. So they run in there with this extra boost of courage and they don't have the right tools to make it happen. It puts them in a dangerous position. The other side on the right is the overcharge condition. And when you look at the overcharge condition, it's probably a little bit more immediate danger because what's going to happen is when you have too much pressure, it's going to find ways to get that pressure out of that canister, out of that container. So what you have is leakage. It spills out. So when you go to use it, it doesn't have what you need inside to put the fire out. It's also highly possible for that cylinder when it's over pressurized to explode or pop off or different things like that. And of course, green is ready for action. So sometimes when I write up my script, I get a little chuckle out of it myself. But uh, really, at this point, you're probably wondering, what the hell am I doing talking about fire extinguishers on a leadership podcast? Well, first off, I like to try and use some practical examples, examples that it doesn't matter what industry you're in or if you're a leader at home or out in the community. Most people have seen a fire extinguisher. Most people understand that gauge that I'm talking about. But secondly, I think that this represents leadership in a huge way. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples right now. And I really don't want to call people out. Sometimes I'd love to, but I don't think that people go out there and try and lead poorly. I just don't think that they know how. So I'm not going to call anybody out on this podcast. I'm going to keep it fairly general. But at the same time, I'm going to give you these couple of examples of this fire extinguisher gauge with leadership examples. So once again, going to the undercharged side of the gauge, the left side of the gauge, I want to talk about, I had one of my children, and I'm going to have a hard time trying to keep this very general, but I had one of my children go out for a sport this year. And I'm going to tell you, I have never been so disappointed in how my children have been coached up until this moment. And it's not because the coaches were bad people. It was because they did not lead well. And I want to make that distinction. Very, very good people, I could see having great conversations with these people. I'm sure they treat everybody great. They're just good people, but poor leaders. And I want to make that distinction very clear. So the first thing is you had kids, you know, in this age group, and let's just say it's 4 to 8. Kids at that age have a lot of energy. They're very distractible. They need to be harnessed and reined in so that they can be coached properly. But this coach did not hold any of the kids, and neither did the assistant coach. They didn't hold any of the kids accountable for their behaviors. They allowed them to do whatever they were going to do. And because of this, it's my opinion, every one of those children, once again, good children, poorly behaved during the sports practice. But the children walked all over them. They walked all over these coaches because they weren't held accountable. I actually remembered at one practice, I overheard, and I'm going to guess that they knew each other, but one of the parents actually called out the coach for not holding kids accountable. And the coach told him, and I was utterly shocked when I heard this, but he said, I had enough of command and control discipline growing up. I'm not going to push that upon these kids. Excuse me? So you had a bad childhood and you're going to push it off the exact opposite way to everybody else? Come on. So once again, he thought that he was doing right. I don't agree with it. All right. In my opinion, this person who was in a leadership role was not leading. And I would say that he was definitely undercharged. So the other side of that equation is being overcharged, right? So once again, being general, I'm just going to state that in my career, I've worked under a lot of different people. All right. So I've had multiple plant jobs, I've had corporate jobs, I've worked for VPs, I've worked for directors, I've worked for plant managers, I've worked for engineers, I've worked for a lot of people. So you can try and guess at this if you know me, but you're probably never going to understand who I'm talking about. So I worked under a person before, and I'll tell you today that this is the worst leader I've ever seen. The worst. So this isn't going to be everybody, but this person overreacted about everything. Everything was an overreaction. It didn't matter how small the issue was. What sucks about that as an employee is I never wanted to tell him anything because of his reaction. And that's not the type of communication that you want. He also dropped his superior names all the time as leverage to make sure that his points made the highest importance. There was one time I actually told this person, you know, you asking me to do it is enough for me. Nobody else matters as much as you do. I work for you. but it never did really matter. He liked to drop his superiors' names, and maybe that was to deflect some off from himself. I don't know what the reason was, but it was a poor practice, I can tell you that. And here's something that still gets to me this day, right? Is our employees need to hear that they do some good too. And this gentleman, and I use that term very loosely, it never mattered how much good was done by myself or by my team. This person would constantly nitpick every little thing to call you out on. And then on the other side of everything that Jocko Willing talks about, this person in a leadership role never took ownership, didn't take ownership for anything. So, for example, and once again, I'm going to keep this general, so I apologize for that. But at the same time, I don't think it's right to call them out here. But my example is there was once I told him something and he forgot it. And this happened multiple times, but this one particular time is what I'm really remembering here is I told him something and he forgot it. And then he chewed my backside for me not telling him what was going on. I gently reminded him that I did tell him in what avenue and what situation. And all of a sudden, he remembered that I told him. And here's the pivotal point in leadership, right? We're all going to make this mistake. I make it quite a few times a week, right? But when he remembered, he had a choice to make. And the choice that he made was not, you know what? I'm sorry, Steve. That's on me. I apologize for chewing your backside for it. I should have wrote it down. You know, he didn't take the road of ownership. What he did was he continued to chew into me, telling me that it was my fault for not reminding him. So this person is definitely overcharged. There's too much pressure in that bottle. They're not handling leadership well. They're leaking out of the seams. They're about ready to explode at any moment. That was his leadership persona. So for the last example, I'm going to put this into the green gauge section. And I'm going to just publicly call out these people because this is an extreme great example. But I'm going to call out the Gracie Barra Gym in Overland Park, Kansas, which myself and my children go to. And I get this privilege of watching my son and my daughter just joined, but I get this privilege of watching these two in the aspect of true leadership. And I'm going to call out three individuals right now. The first one is Professor Lucas. I'm also going to call out his wife, Professor Silvana. And then the third one I'm going to call out is Coach Austin. So I just sent them a letter on this too, but the cool thing about this, even though all three of these people have individual leadership personas, they still all excel in leadership. And I'm just going to tell you some bullet points along the way here, but at the beginning of every class with the children, and we're talking about children that, are 4 through 7, what they do at the beginning is they set expectations. And actually every transition, they also set expectations. They are very good at telling the kids, We need you to sit in a semicircle, watch the technique. Will answer questions after watching the technique, and so on and so forth. They're very good at setting expectations. Within that, they also talk about behavior and what's expected for asking questions and different things like that. They set the entire package of expectation. Something that's subtle but worth calling out is they also use the right tones of their voice. When they need to command a little bit more attention, they use a different voice tone. When they are congratulatory, they use a different voice tone. Different things like that. They're able to manage an entire group, but also go to a single person. It is absolutely amazing. And I think when I talk about that, I think that classroom teachers could be taught this. I think frontline supervisors should be taught this. People in leadership roles in general should be taught things like this. They address issues at the time. So my son has a lot of energy. Sometimes he has a hard time controlling that. They set the expectation, they let him know what's going to happen, but then they also address the issue. My son has been pulled out of class, set against the wall for 2-minute time period, and there's a timer, and he can't engage with the rest of class. So they address the issue, they hold him accountable. But the cool thing after the accountability is that they're able to do this reset function. They don't continue to be angry. They address the issue, they held him accountable. They uh, they talk to him one-on-one. Everybody resets and they go back into class and it's done. On the flip side of that, they also do a very good job walking around, engaging with the kids singly as a pair while they're rolling, and they're congratulating accomplishments. Cool thing about belt programs too is getting stripes on belts and promotions and all that stuff. They're continuously congratulating accomplishments, but we don't just give it to them. What they do is they have to earn it through behavior, technique, and showing up, right? It's not just this trophy that gets handed to kids. They actually have to do something for it. So, what I'd say about the green gauge is that it's a perfect balance when you're dead center of that green gauge. So, let me bring a little bit of my personal experience into this for a second. So, I want to talk about a little bit of time in my life where I was definitely undercharged. So, I've held multiple corporate roles in my life for a major protein company. I've been a senior manager of corporate maintenance. I've been a director of asset reliability. I've been a director of engineering. So, three different roles within the corporate environment. Within those roles, I've had different groups of employees. And at one point in time, I inherited an entire team rather than getting to pick my own team. That was probably when I was the most undercharged in my leadership. I lacked accountability with some of these team members because they had very, very strong personalities and I did not know how to deal with them. They were very combative and I didn't stop things. I wasn't very good at setting expectations and holding them accountable. I really just kind of sunk back at this point in time. And to my luck back then, I had some of them leave the team. And I don't know if it's to my luck or whatever. It was easy at the time that they left because then I was able to put the right people in place. However, those people, if my leadership was better, they might have survived or stayed with that group. I've also been on the right side of the gauge where I've been overcharged. And early in my career, when I was a maintenance supervisor, I'm going to tell you, whew, I would have never worked for me. There is no way that I would have lasted over 48 hours working for Steve Baumgartner. I held a lot of stress. I was very angry. I wasn't leading in my home. I wasn't leading in the community. I wasn't leading at work. I just wasn't a leader. I didn't have really any good mentors around me. What I did was I got angry. I stayed angry. I worked people down. I went toe to toe with some of the maintenance people who worked with me. I would throw a hard hat in an instant when I got pissed off. And my people didn't listen to me. They didn't want to work for me. They just did it because they needed that paycheck at the end of the week. And then there's been other times in my career where I've been green. Right now is one of those times. And in my director roles, I hit those times as well in my career. These are those points where you feel like they're really coming together and you can feel it on the inside. When your people trust you, when they want to follow you. All right. Great. So a lot of examples there, Steve. What's the big lesson this week? How do I, as a leader, stay in the green, you might be asking? So my answer to that is I like to look towards John Maxwell's 5 levels of leadership. And with those 5 levels of leadership, the higher on these levels that you achieve, it really brings you into center of that green. So before we get into these levels, before I tell you anything about them, the first step to all this is leaders. All right, take a deep breath in. All right. You got to start out with being entirely freaking real with yourself for a change. It's going to sting a little bit, people. It's going to sting when we start being real with ourselves. We're not all perfect. I know it's a shock, but we're not all perfect. We all want to believe that we're the best leaders in the world, and myself included, right? But the truth is, it's not always the case. God knows it's not the case with me. I definitely have ups and downs. Second step is after we make this decision to be just entirely truthful with ourselves, and I'm not talking about a beat down, you just got to be realistic. Second thing is we need to determine where we're at on these 5 levels of leadership. We need to do a little bit of an assessment. And the interesting thing is that this isn't a one and done. We can't do this assessment one time. We need to do it on a frequency so that we know if we're growing or slipping backwards. And we also need to do it anytime that there's a change. So what constitutes a change What if you change roles, right? You just took a promotion. That would constitute a change. What about if one of the leaders that you lead changes out? It's probably a major change. You probably need to reassess, and multiple other reasons. But we need to assess where we're at today. So let's do this initial assessment, and then let's continue this assessment periodically or when there's a major change. And you're going to have to define those for yourself. So here's the 5 levels of leadership by John Maxwell. First is position. So position is when you just enter a role because you are excelling at the role that you were in before. And what happens when you enter this level of position is that people follow you because they have to. Someone else has just told them that you're their leader. So they know that by rank, they have to follow you. That's why it's called position. The next level, level 2, is permission. So this is where, you might have a few wins with employees. You took them out, for lunch. You explained what you're doing there, what your focuses are, what have you. And what the employees start to do is give you their approval, a little bit of buy-in. That's why it's called the permission level, because they're like, maybe this guy's not going to be so bad after all. Yeah, what he's saying kind of makes sense. Level 3 is production, right? This is when we really take that team, we're getting it molded, we have buy-in, we're getting people involved, and results are starting to come from that. We're producing results. The results really speak for themselves as far as how a team's doing. So, for example, it might be your financials at work. Your financials are coming into line, your safety numbers, whatever the case is. And this is all independent of the industry or the community or your family or whatever, right? These 5 levels, let's talk about those first 3 for a second at home. The position is, I'm your father and I told you so, right? The permission is when, you know what? Dad told me that this was going to be hard, but that we need to work through it and that we need to try. You know what? He's probably right. I think I'm going to try a little bit harder today. It's going to be hard. And then the production is when we see those children, out in society, and they're doing the things that we ask them to do, and they're really producing results. So level 4, we step into people development. And this is really when a leader creates other leaders. So it's pretty self-explanatory in the workplace. A lot of people try and fake it. Yeah, go to this training class, you'll be a better leader. But no, this is when we start taking people under our wing. This is when we equip people with the right tools, but we also offer them the chance to use them. And then they go out there and they solve a problem, create something, and they bring it back to us. And we might give them a little bit of critique. That's all right. But we also acknowledge the accomplishment that they did. We're creating that other leader because we're helping to build them up. We're keeping this balance. We're letting them show that they're capable. We're building their self-confidence. We create other leaders. And then once that you master that, you can work on level 5, which is pinnacle. It's the top of the food chain, baby. So when you're at the pinnacle, generally what you see is you see these CEOs, uh, Simon Sinek's probably at the pinnacle, right? Top of his industry. People are carrying on their mission, next generation people carry on their mission because it was so powerful. So let me go through those again. You got to assess where you're at. Level 1's position. Level 2's permission. Level 3's production. Level 4's people development. Level 5 is pinnacle. All right, now that we've assessed it, right? We just had this assessment done. We paid for this consultant. You don't need a consultant, but just using that for a little bit of a joke. A lot of people, in manufacturing, we get these huge assessments done at our plant. Costs us $20,000, and then we put it in the file cabinet. So that brings us into step 3. You cannot put it in the file cabinet. So what you need to do is you need to complete a gap analysis. Where am I? Where do I need to be? What do I need to do to get there? All right. So now you're going to take that gap analysis, move into step 4. You need to develop the skills to fill the gaps, right? So here's the most interesting thing about leadership, in my opinion. Leadership skills are like every other skill. And I've read a lot of case studies on how to build skills. And most case studies that I've read are 3 points. 10% of learning for new skills comes through book work. 20% comes through mentorship. 70% comes with going out there and practicing the damn skills. But what do we do every time that we have a company sponsored or we send someone out to training for leadership? What do? They get a textbook. They get maybe some talk. They get asked some questions. They might take a test at the end. All of a sudden, they're supposed to be a great leader, right? They go back to their place of employment, and what happens? They go back to the same situation with the same people, with the same everything. And the mentorship that is 20% of the equation, it's not there. So unless that person comes back fully fired up and wants to practice that, more times than not, that training has been useless. All right. I probably just angered every training person that might be listening to this podcast, but it's a real world issue. What happens is that we send them to training to check a box and we don't really fill the gaps. Every person who goes out to training should have a plan for when they come back. All right. So remember that. You need to develop the skills to fill the gaps. To develop the skills, 10% bookwork, 20% mentorship, 70% going out there and practicing the skills. And that floats back and forth to the mentorship piece because you need some feedback. Then you need to assess yourself. right? So after action reviews. I like to do after action reviews every dang day. So what went well? What didn't go so well? How can I improve what didn't go so well? Things like that is what you should be asking yourself on a periodic basis. And when you start to problem solve all those things that didn't go so well in your leadership, you're going to find that you focus in on your deficiencies and turn them into strengths over time. All right, so that was a lot of words, people. So let me just recap that, and I'll try and do this very succinctly. Number one, you got to be real with yourself. We need to start there. Stop lying to yourself, be real. Number two, determine what kind of leader you are on the levels. And those levels are position, permission, production, people development, pinnacle. If you want more information on the 5 levels of leadership, look them up, John Maxwell. Third, we need to complete a gap analysis. Where are you at right now? Where do you want to go? What are those gaps? 4, develop those skills to fill the gaps. And then last but not least, you need to periodically assess your progress. All right, so let's stay green on the gauge, on the leadership fire extinguisher gauge. Let's stay in the green. So that's a wrap for this message. And I just want to state that leaders, you come here to listen to this message, but listening is not enough. What are you going to apply this week, this month, and this year? Remember, when you become a better leader, you become a better spouse. You become a better parent, a better coworker, and ultimately that person that other people want to follow. So go out there and grow in your leadership skills and do it for your family, for your community, and for the ones that you lead at work. Lead well, my friends. If you found that you appreciate what you heard here today, I really invite you to leave a rating and review. Smash that subscribe button on whatever podcasting app you're currently listening to. And I invite you back to join us in the Forge as we bring you lessons learned on the front lines of leadership. Once again, we have some great guests that are going to be joining us on the upcoming weeks and months. We have Nick Lavery lined up. Nick is an awesome person. If you don't know Nick, look him up. We're going to have Nancy Regan, who is a leader in reliability out in the world. She's done some amazing things. She's got this aptitude for taking complex topics and breaking them down into real world examples. I admire Nancy a lot. We're also going to have Tony Ojeda coming up. Tony's a friend of mine, went to the same church. He's built out a planner and a way to structure your life, lead yourself towards goals. He's got a coaching business, a financial practice. Absolutely phenomenal. And we got plenty others on tap as well that we're trying to lock down right now. But it's going to be a great 2023 and an even better 2024.
You have just experienced the heat and pressure of the Forge. Remember, words without action are meaningless. Now, after the heat of the Forge, shape your thoughts, quench your brain, Then put your new tools to use, adding to your leadership. Tune in next week for more lessons from the Forge.